I still remember the first time I drove back to my grandma's cabin after she passed. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 27 at the time. My grandma, Mary, had lived in a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of northern Minnesota, near a stretch of thick woods and an old dirt road that hardly anyone used anymore. She had left the cabin to me in her will, along with the land, and I hadn't been back there since I was a teenager. I drove up there in my old truck, the bed packed with a few supplies and some tools, because my plan was to clean up the place and maybe stay a few nights to see if it was worth fixing up. The cabin was about 40 minutes from the nearest small town, and the last part of the drive was all gravel road. Dust kicked up behind me as I went, and I could see the tall pine trees stretching on both sides of the road. The cabin sat tucked behind some overgrowth, not visible from the road unless you already knew where to turn in. I had my dog with me, a big shepherd mix named Duke. He was restless the whole ride, shifting around in the passenger seat and staring out the window. I figured he was just excited about the new smells of the forest. When I pulled into the small clearing and saw the cabin again, it looked almost the same as I remembered, but more worn down. The roof shingles were dark with age, the wooden boards gray from weather, and the porch leaned slightly forward. The grass around the place had grown high, and thorny weeds spread near the front steps. I parked, grabbed my bag, and let Duke out. He ran in circles, sniffing everything, his tail wagging hard at first. The air smelled heavy of pine and damp earth, the way it always does after a few days of rain. The woods behind the cabin were so dense it looked almost black past a few yards in. I unlocked the front door, which took some work since the key was rusty and the lock stiff, and stepped inside. Dust was everywhere, floating in the sunlight that came through the half-closed blinds. The air smelled stale, like wood that had soaked up years of smoke and dampness. The furniture was the same as I remembered, heavy old chairs and a couch with faded fabric. My grandma had been the kind of person who kept things forever, so nothing had changed much. I set my bag down and walked through the rooms, checking everything. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a storage room in the back. Everything looked untouched. Duke, though, wasn't calm. He kept pacing from room to room, his ears up, tail stiff. He wasn't barking, just acting like something was bothering him. I brushed it off as him adjusting to a new place. The first night went by slow. I cooked a simple meal, set out some food for Duke, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The woods grew darker and darker until the whole clearing seemed swallowed by blackness. I didn't hear cars, I didn't hear people, just crickets, the occasional owl, and the rustle of trees. Inside, with only the dim lamp light, every creak of the woods seemed louder. Duke stayed close to me, lying near the couch, but every so often his head shot up, ears perked, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. That made me uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I started cleaning. I swept, cleared cobwebs, and opened windows to air the place out. The storage room in the back was the last spot I went into. The door stuck a bit, and when it opened, a musty smell rolled out that was stronger than the rest of the cabin. The room was packed with boxes, old furniture stacked against the wall, and some tools. Duke didn't want to go in. He stood at the door, whining softly. That's when I noticed something strange in the corner. There was a section of the wooden floor that looked slightly different, like the boards had been replaced or weren't nailed down the same way as the rest. At first I ignored it and started moving boxes, but the smell in the room only grew stronger, and it wasn't just musty anymore. It had a sour, almost metallic bite to it. I pulled more boxes aside, and Duke stayed at the doorway, watching me with his ears low. The boards in that corner were loose. I could see gaps between them. I knelt down, pried one up with a screwdriver from the toolbox, and it lifted easier than it should have. Underneath was a shallow space, almost like someone had cut out a section of the crawl space below. And then the smell hit me full force. It was unmistakable. I gagged and had to cover my nose. Duke barked once, sharp and loud, then growled. I forced myself to look down into the space, shining a flashlight I'd grabbed earlier. What I saw made me stumble back so fast I almost tripped over the boxes. There was a body down there. It was wrapped in old plastic sheeting, but parts of it had torn open. What I could see was dark, shriveled, and sunken, but still clearly human. The smell was overwhelming, even though it was obvious it had been there for a very long time. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I had no idea what to do. My first thought was that it might have been there for decades, maybe even before my grandma owned the place, but that didn't make it less terrifying. The plastic was yellowed and brittle, the kind used years ago. Whoever had put it there hadn't wanted it to be found. I stumbled out of the room, grabbing Duke by the collar to drag him with me, and went outside into the fresh air. I stood in the yard for a long time, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. My hands were shaking. It was hours before I worked up the courage to go back in, just long enough to grab my phone. There was no service at the cabin, so I had to drive until I hit a spot on the road with a signal. I called the county sheriff's office, explained what I found as clearly as I could, and waited in my truck until a deputy came out to meet me. By the time I brought them back to the cabin, the sun was already setting again. They went into the storage room, pulled up the boards, and confirmed what I had seen. They didn't give me details, but I could tell from their faces it wasn't the first time they'd seen something like that. Over the next few days, more people came, investigators, crime scene techs. They asked questions, took pictures, bagged evidence. They told me very little, only that it was indeed human remains and they would try to identify who it was and how long it had been there. I stayed at a motel in town while they worked. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the cabin. The thought that my grandma had lived there all those years with that hidden under the floor made my skin crawl. Maybe she didn't know, maybe she did. I'll never get an answer to that. In the end, the cabin became more of a burden than anything else. I couldn't see it as a family place anymore. It was tied to something dark, something I wanted no part of. I eventually sold the land, signing the papers without ever stepping foot inside again. I still think about it sometimes, though. The way the boards lifted so easily, the smell that clung to my clothes even after I left, and how Duke had sensed something was wrong from the very beginning. No matter how much time passes, that image of the dark space under the floorboards, with that shape wrapped in plastic, will never leave me. It's one thing to hear about something like that on the news. It's another thing entirely to pull it up with your own hands, in a place you once thought was safe. And that was the last time I ever saw my grandma's cabin. I was 26 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small rented cabin in northern Arizona, not far from the Navajo Nation land. It was the fall of 1999, late September, when the nights were already starting to get cold, and the days were short enough that the sun dipped behind the pine trees earlier than I liked. The cabin was tucked off a dirt road about 3 miles from the nearest paved highway. It wasn't fancy. 2 small rooms, a wood stove, and a narrow porch that creaked when I walked across it. I had brought enough canned food, dry goods, and water to last. My plan was simple. No distractions, no city noise, just time away. I'd always liked being by myself, and I figured I'd get some writing done, read some books, and just reset my head before moving back into the grind of regular life. The first couple of days were quiet. I spent time stacking what I had collected, walking the dirt trails nearby, and watching the way the shadows stretched long over the ground as the sun went down. At night, the silence was heavier than I expected. No cars in the distance, no hum of neighbors' TVs, just the occasional rustle of a branch or a coyote yipping far off. I kept a lantern near my bed, and most nights I found myself lighting it long before I needed to, just so I didn't have to sit in complete dark. By the 4th night, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Small things at first. I had a heavy cooler I kept outside near the porch, filled with ice and a few drinks. One morning, the lid was halfway off, and the ice was scattered, melted across the ground. At first, I blamed raccoons, but when I crouched to look closer, the cooler itself was dragged a good 3 feet from where I had set it. I saw no claw marks, no trash scattered, no chew marks, just the cooler shifted. Later that same day, I went for a short walk near a dry creek bed about a half-mile from the cabin. The dirt was soft, and I noticed prints along the bank. At first, I thought they were animal prints, maybe a dog or coyote, but the longer I looked, the more wrong they felt. They weren't shaped like regular paws, not clean like a boot either. They were long, uneven, and some looked almost like bare human feet, except too narrow, with the toes oddly spaced. A few were deep in the mud, sunk down like whoever or whatever made them was heavy. I didn't stay there long. I told myself it was probably just a barefoot hiker or someone messing around in the area. But that answer didn't sit well, especially since the tracks led out of the creek bed and toward the thick trees. That night, I was restless. I had locked the door, slid the small deadbolt across, and checked the windows. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. Not the kind of scratching noise animals make, not the quick light steps of a deer either. This was slower. It sounded like careful, heavy footsteps on the dirt near the porch. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tight. I didn't turn on the lantern at first. I just listened. The sound moved across the porch boards. Each creak stretched out like whoever it was knew I was listening. I finally lit the lantern, and for a second, the sound stopped. I thought maybe I had scared whatever was off, but then I heard it again, this time at the far end of the porch, near the window by the small kitchen. I stayed still, my eyes fixed on the thin curtains. Nothing pressed against them, nothing shadowed them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing right there, waiting. After maybe 10 minutes, the noise stopped completely. The woods went quiet again, so quiet it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The following morning, I went outside to check. The porch had a thin layer of dirt on the boards from the wind, and I could see smudged prints leading across it. They weren't sharp enough to make out details, but they weren't boots either. They were long, uneven impressions, like the ones I had seen in the creek bed. I forced myself not to overthink it, told myself maybe it was just someone wandering nearby, though I couldn't explain why they would be barefoot in the middle of the night. On the 7th day, things escalated. I was chopping wood in the late afternoon when I caught movement in the tree-line. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but when I looked again, I saw a figure. Tall, thin, standing half-hidden behind a pine trunk. Too far to make out details, but definitely a person. They didn't move when I stared. I shouted out, just a quick noise to let them know I saw them, but they didn't respond. They stayed in that same spot. I set the axe down and walked toward the cabin, keeping my eyes locked on that tree. By the time I got to the porch, the figure was gone. I stayed inside the rest of the evening. Every noise outside set my nerves on edge. I kept the lantern close and the axe by the door. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to scratching sounds. Not small like a raccoon digging around. These were long, dragging scratches against the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, moving from one wall to the next like something circling. My chest tightened with every sound. I thought about running to the truck and leaving right then, but the idea of stepping outside into the dark while whatever was moved around out there stopped me cold. The scratching lasted maybe an hour, stopping and starting, until finally it faded off into the distance. At sunrise, I forced myself to check. On the back wall of the cabin, the wood was scraped. Not deep gouges, but shallow marks, long streaks running in parallel lines. The last night I stayed there was the worst. The day had already been tense, with me catching more glimpses of movement in the trees. By evening, I had packed up most of my things, ready to leave early the next morning. I barely ate, too wired to feel hungry. When the sun went down, I sat inside, lantern burning bright, waiting. It didn't take long. Just after midnight, I heard it again, the slow steps on the porch, then a knock. Not hard, not frantic, just a single knock, and then silence. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. A few minutes later, another knock, softer this time, followed by what sounded like a long inhale, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I gripped the axe so tight my hands ached. I could see the thin curtain shift slightly, like someone brushed against it, but I never looked directly. I couldn't bring myself to. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I left at first light. I didn't look back, didn't stop to check the porch or the ground for prints. I drove the dirt road fast, the truck bouncing hard over every rut, until I reached the highway. I never went back to that cabin. I told the rental owner that something felt wrong, and I cut my stay short. I didn't explain. To this day, I don't know what was out there. I can reason it out as a person messing with me, someone living rough in the woods, or some strange animal behavior. But the way it moved, the way it waited, the way it scratched at the walls like it was testing me, it didn't feel like any person or animal I've ever known. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound in my head. That slow, deliberate knock. And I'm glad I never opened the door to see what stood on the other side. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, and by the time night came it was heavier than I had expected. I was 32 years old, standing in the middle of a clearing deep in the woods of northern Idaho in the year 2004, with the weak beam of my flashlight catching the endless stream of raindrops as they slanted sideways through the cold air. My boots were already caked in mud, and my jeans were sticking to my legs. The clearing had been my chosen spot for weeks. I had been carrying lumber piece by piece from a road half a mile away, dragging it on a small handcart and laying it out in piles. My plan had been simple. Build a small cabin from scratch, nothing fancy, just a structure that could keep me dry and warm when I came out here. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The storm had turned into a hard pounding rain that made everything slick and miserable. Still, I had come too far to stop. The ground was soft but not flooded yet, and I had enough supplies to make a start. I had been staying in a tent nearby, but the wind had torn at it all evening, snapping the thin poles until one had bent nearly in half. That tent wasn't going to survive the night. I needed something stronger, something with real walls, even if it was only halfway done by the time the storm let up. The forest around me felt heavier in the rain. The tall pines swayed slightly, their branches dripping thick streams of water, the air filled with the sound of thousands of drops hitting needles, bark, and the mud at my feet. It wasn't the soft patter of a gentle shower. It was a steady roar, like a crowd of whispers surrounding me. My flashlight beam barely reached past 20 feet before it turned into a hazy blur of mist and wet trunks. I could feel how far away I was from anything human, and every time I stopped hammering a nail or cutting a board, the silence of my own stillness would make the forest noise louder, sharper, almost hostile. I worked methodically, forcing my focus on the wood in front of me. I had already staked out a rough rectangle for the cabin's foundation, simple posts set into the ground that I had leveled by hand. The rain made it hard to see the marks I had carved into the boards, but I lined them up by touch, hammering nails with a small mallet I had carried in my pack. The boards groaned as I fastened them together. My hands were shaking from the cold, but I kept moving, telling myself that as long as I had walls, I could shelter inside even if the roof wasn't perfect yet. The mud was the real problem. Every step I took sucked at my boots, and I could feel the water seeping through the seams. When I dropped a board, it splashed and was coated instantly. I tried to wipe the mud off with my sleeve, but it only smeared darker stains across the wood. My fingers slipped often, nails bending under the hammer because I wasn't steady enough. Each mistake cost me more time, and I felt the hours pressing down harder than the rain. By midnight, I had 3 walls framed. They leaned awkwardly, and the edges weren't as straight as they should have been, but they stood. The 4th wall was slower. My flashlight battery was running down, the circle of light dimming more and more, so I worked by lantern instead. Its small yellow flame was nearly drowned by the storm, but I shielded it with my body, crouched low to keep it alive. The wind funneled through the half-built structure, and for a while it sounded like a deep groan, almost like the cabin itself was alive and complaining. That sound raised the hair on my arms, but I forced myself to ignore it. I thought often about the stories I had heard from locals back in town. They had told me not to bother building out here, that the woods weren't worth the trouble. Too much wildlife, too far from the main road, too many ways for something to go wrong. They said the land was too unforgiving, especially for someone alone. I hadn't believed them, or maybe I hadn't cared. I had wanted this cabin more than anything. I wanted a place that was mine, hidden from everything else. When I started on the roof, the real fear set in. Balancing wet boards above my head, hammering them into beams that shifted under the weight of the rain, was nearly impossible. My arms were sore, my shoulders ached, and each gust of wind threatened to throw the boards out of my hands. Twice I nearly slipped off the makeshift ladder I had propped against the frame. The ground below was a pool of mud, and the thought of falling, twisting an ankle or worse, terrified me more than anything else that night. I would have been stuck out there alone, unable to move, soaked through in the cold, and nobody would know. I forced myself to move slower. Nail by nail, board by board, I got a partial roof across the top. It wasn't sealed. Water still dripped through the cracks, but it was better than nothing. I climbed down, breathing hard, my shirt plastered to my skin. I dragged the lantern inside the 4 walls and sat down against one of them, staring at the rain falling through the gaps. Inside, it was darker and quieter, but not completely. The rain still beat against the wood, finding its way through small holes and seams. I could hear the wind whistling above, and the occasional crack of a tree somewhere in the distance as it bent under the storm. The forest was alive with noise, but the cabin dulled it enough that I felt a little safer. I wrapped my jacket tighter and tried to ignore the water dripping onto my face. Sleep was out of the question. My body was too sore, my nerves too sharp. Every sound outside made me stiffen. The woods at night were not kind, especially in weather like this. I thought about the animals that might wander close. Black bears, cougars, even smaller things like raccoons or coyotes. I had food with me, and I knew they could smell it. My knife was in my pack, but I knew it wasn't much use against anything serious. Time dragged on. The lantern flickered lower, the fuel nearly gone, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed to grow. The walls looked thin, flimsy, not nearly strong enough. The roof creaked as the wind pressed against it, and I half expected it to rip away. I wondered if I had made a mistake, rushing to build in the middle of a storm, alone, with nothing but rough lumber and a handful of tools. But I also knew I had no choice. The tent was gone, and without these walls I would be sitting in the open, drenched and shivering. By the time the rain slowed, I was shivering uncontrollably, my teeth clicking together, but I was still alive. The first light of morning crept gray and weak through the cracks, and I pulled myself to my feet. The storm had left the clearing soaked and wrecked, branches scattered across the ground, puddles everywhere. But my cabin, though crooked and half-built, was still standing. I stepped outside, blinking at the wet daylight, and looked back at what I had built. It wasn't much, not compared to what I had imagined. It leaned in places, the roof sagged, and mud was splattered across every board. but it was real. I had survived the night inside it, and I knew that if I kept at it, I could make it strong enough to last. The fear of the storm lingered in my bones, the memory of the dark and the noise pressing close. But as I stood there, soaked to the skin with my boots sinking into the mud, I felt a strange sense of pride. The cabin wasn't finished, but it was mine. I had built it with my own hands, and even though the night had been the longest and hardest I had lived through, the morning had come, and I was still here. That was enough. I hadn't been back to that part of northern Minnesota since the divorce. The last time I drove those roads, the air had been thick with shouting inside the truck, and the silence afterward was worse. It had been 8 years since then. I was 43 now, older and heavier, and though my life had moved on in some ways, I still carried a sharp edge of anger when his name came up. His cabin was tucked off a narrow gravel road by the tree line, a place he always bragged about building with his own hands. I never liked it. It felt too isolated, too far from town, with the lake spreading out cold and gray behind it. When we split, he kept it, and I told myself I'd never set foot anywhere near it again. But life has a way of dragging you back into places you swore you'd avoid. That autumn, my sister needed me to pick up some old boxes of hers from a storage shed that just happened to be near his cabin. I didn't think much of it at first. I left after work one Friday, late in the afternoon, and I didn't plan to stop anywhere near him. I told myself it would be quick, grab the boxes, drive back before it got dark. By the time I finished loading the boxes into my trunk, the sky was already turning. The air had that heavy stillness that comes before night in the woods, when every shadow seems to settle deeper. I started driving back and realized the fastest way out was to cut down the old back road that curved past his cabin. I slowed when I hit the gravel stretch, the crunch of the tires sounding loud with the windows cracked. The cabin came into view between the pines. Even from the road, I could see the roof sagging more than I remembered, and the shutters on one side were loose. It looked abandoned. He had always been proud of keeping it neat, fixing every nail and board, so seeing it like that sent a shiver through me. Part of me wanted to speed up and get past it, but I eased my foot on the brake instead. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, made me slow down. I pulled over a few yards down, telling myself I'd just look. The air was damp, cool, and carried the faint smell of wet leaves. I stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked closer. The trees were tall around the place, so the light was already dim even though the sun hadn't fully gone. The porch steps sagged when I put my weight on them. There was no car parked out front, no sign anyone had been around. The windows were dirty, streaked with rain. I cupped my hands to one and tried to peer in, but it was too dark inside. My stomach felt heavy, my pulse climbing for no real reason I could explain. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it with my palm and it gave a low groan as it swung open. The air inside hit me first, a stale mix of mildew, dust, and something sour. I stepped in and the floorboards creaked under me. The cabin hadn't changed much. The same stone fireplace, the same worn couch he refused to replace, the same shelf with old hunting magazines. But it all looked abandoned, like no one had lived here in years. Dust coated everything. The curtains were half torn. A coffee mug sat on the table, still stained from the last drink, as if someone had left in a hurry. I walked slowly, my footsteps sounding too loud. My throat felt dry. I tried to remind myself it was just an empty cabin, nothing to be afraid of. But the longer I stayed inside, the stronger that feeling grew. That something was off, wrong in a way that didn't need words. In the corner near the kitchen, I noticed a stack of boxes. I thought at first they were just storage, but when I looked closer, they were filled with canned food, neatly stacked, some of it only a few months old. That didn't make sense. The place looked abandoned, but someone had been coming back, stalking it. I felt a chill and turned toward the hallway. The air was cooler back there. I walked past the bathroom, then the bedroom. The bed was made, but the blanket was rumpled, and the pillow had a faint indentation, like someone had slept there not long ago. I froze when I heard it, the faintest sound, the kind you almost mistake for your own breath. A soft scuff of movement, my ears strained, came from the back room, the one he used to keep locked. My heart started pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I told myself to leave, just walk out and get back in the car. But I stood there, staring at that door. It was half open. The shadows inside were deep, and I couldn't see what was in there. I took a step, then another. The floor creaked louder under my weight, and the sound in the room stopped. I reached the doorway and leaned slightly. The room was darker than the rest, no window, just shelves against the walls. For a second, it looked empty. Then I noticed a sleeping bag on the floor, crumpled, and beside it a small pile of clothes. They weren't his. They looked newer, different sizes. My stomach twisted as I realized someone else had been living here. That's when I heard it again. The sharp crack of a stick outside, near the tree line. It wasn't far. I turned fast, my breath caught in my chest. Through the dirty window, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shape, then nothing. I didn't wait. I turned and moved quickly back through the cabin, trying to stay quiet even though my steps echoed. The porch creaked loud as I hit it, and the air outside felt colder. I hurried toward my car, my keys already in my hand, my eyes scanning the trees. I could feel it, that same heavy sense that I wasn't alone out there. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the lock and pulled the door open. I slid inside, slammed it shut, and locked it. My breath fogged the glass. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the cabin. The trees behind it swayed slightly in the wind, but I couldn't shake the image of that shape moving. I started the engine, gravel spraying as I pulled away. My headlights cut through the dim woods, and I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out into the road. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where the lights of a gas station glowed in the distance. Only then did I let myself breathe, my hands still gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. The cabin hadn't been empty. Someone was staying there, living in it quietly, maybe for weeks or months. I didn't know who, and I didn't want to, but I understood one thing clearly as I drove away. If I'd stayed even a few minutes longer, I might have come face to face with whoever it was. And out there, in the middle of those dark woods, far from anyone who could hear me, I wasn't sure I would have made it out. I never drove that back road again. I never wanted to see that cabin, or the shadow of it, standing there waiting in the trees. I was 32 the summer I drove out to that old cabin in northern Wisconsin. It wasn't mine, but it had been sitting on land that once belonged to a distant uncle of mine, a man who passed in the late 80s. Nobody had lived there since. The family never bothered to sell it, maybe because it was too far from town, maybe because the place was too worn down to be worth much. For years it just sat there in the woods, swallowed slowly by trees and silence. I had some time off that July, and I wanted a place to get away. A quiet spot where I wouldn't hear traffic or deal with neighbors. The cabin seemed like it could give me that. The drive out was long. Once I left the paved highway, the road turned into a narrow gravel path that twisted through pine and birch. I could feel my tires crunching over loose stone as the forest thickened around me. The sun barely broke through the canopy. My phone had already dropped to 0 bars, and I knew then I was going to be completely cut off. A part of me liked that, but another part of me felt uneasy. No one knew this place. No one came out here anymore. When I reached the clearing, The cabin stood there like a sagging shadow of its past. The wood was gray and split, the roof leaned on one side, and weeds wrapped themselves around the porch posts. A rusted old mailbox sat crooked near the tree line. It didn't even have a door anymore. The windows were dirty, one of them cracked, and the front steps looked like they'd snap if I put too much weight on them. But it was still standing, still solid enough to stay in for a few nights. Inside, the air smelled thick, wood rot mixed with dust. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. The floor creaked under every step. There was an old table with one leg shorter than the others, two chairs that looked like they'd collapse if I leaned back too far, and a narrow bed frame in the corner. A rolled-up mattress leaned against the wall, stained with old watermarks. I unrolled it and shook off what dust I could. It wasn't comfortable, but I hadn't come for comfort. I came to be alone. That first night was quiet, too quiet. When you live around towns and streets, you get used to a constant hum. Cars in the distance, voices, maybe dogs barking. Out here, there was nothing but the high buzz of cicadas, then complete silence when the air cooled. I lay on the mattress listening, waiting for some sound. My own heartbeat felt too loud. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep, but every snap of a branch outside, every groan of the wood frame beneath me jolted me back awake. By morning, I convinced myself I was just adjusting. I boiled water on a small camping stove I brought, had some instant coffee, and sat out on the porch. The forest stretched endlessly, green and unmoving, until a crow flapped overhead and broke the stillness. The air felt heavy with that kind of damp northern heat that seeps into your clothes. I thought about how isolated I really was. Miles from the nearest town, no phone service, no one even aware that I was staying here. That thought sat in my mind longer than it should have. The second night, I noticed something. Just after midnight, when I was lying half awake on the mattress, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, crunching on the ground, like someone trying not to be heard. My chest tightened. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The steps came closer, circling the cabin. I didn't have curtains on the windows, so anyone out there could have looked right in at me lying on the floor. I thought about getting up, about checking, but something in me froze. The steps stopped near the front door. I stared at it, waiting for the handle to turn. Nothing. After a long minute, I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the trees. I barely slept after that. By sunrise, I was exhausted, shaky from the long hours of silence and tension. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a black bear. But the way it moved, the even pace, the circling, it didn't feel like that. I kept replaying the sound in my head, the deliberate weight of each step. The third day, I tried to distract myself. I walked the tree line, studied the overgrown path leading further north, collected some fallen branches to stack by the porch. I tried to make it feel normal, like camping, but the thought of those footsteps wouldn't leave me. When the sun dropped again and the woods turned black, my chest tightened with dread. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and sat awake listening. Around 1 in the morning, the steps came back. This time they were heavier, less careful. I heard the dry crunch of leaves, closer and closer until they scraped against the porch. I sat frozen, a hammer clutched in my hand, because it was the only thing I had for defense. The wood on the porch groaned. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing right outside the door. I could hear breathing now, slow and steady, not animal-like. Human. They didn't knock. They didn't try the handle. They just stood there. I could feel my skin crawl with the weight of it. After what felt like forever, the steps retreated again. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I decided to leave. I packed my bag quickly, hands shaking, ready to throw everything into the car and drive until I hit the nearest diner or gas station. When I stepped outside, the sight froze me in place. In the dirt around the cabin, there were clear boot prints. Not deer hooves, Not animal tracks. Human boots, circling the cabin, stopping at the porch. Some were fresh, sharp in the soil. Others overlapped like it had been happening more than once. I didn't even stop to think. I shoved my bag into the car and started the engine. The gravel kicked up as I sped down the narrow road, branches scraping the side mirrors as I twisted back toward the main highway. My heart hammered until I saw the open stretch of blacktop, until the trees finally thinned and I could see sky again. I didn't slow down for miles. When I finally reached a small town, I pulled over at a gas station and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. My body felt drained, like every nerve had been stretched thin. I thought about those footsteps circling me in the dark, about how easily they could have come in if they wanted to. The door had no real lock. The windows were thin. If whoever it was had decided to open that door, I wouldn't be here. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell anyone in my family either. It sat there for decades without anyone caring, and I figured it could keep sitting there, rotting quietly into the ground. But sometimes at night, when I wake up and my house feels too quiet, I remember the weight of those footsteps, the steady breathing on the other side of the door, and I wonder how long they'd been watching me before I even noticed. I drove up the old logging road with the back of my truck heavy with supplies. The road was more dirt than gravel, and every bump rattled the boxes I had stacked in the back. It was the summer of 1996, late July, and the heat sat heavy even though I was heading higher into the hills. My uncle had given me the small cabin after he moved down south. He said I could use it as a place to get away for a while. I was 27 then, restless, tired of city noise, and the thought of being out there alone seemed like what I needed. The cabin was tucked about 10 miles past the last paved stretch of road. The deeper I drove, the more the woods swallowed everything. The trees leaned over the road, branches brushing against the truck, and there were no signs, no markers, nothing to show anyone had lived out there for years. The place had no electricity, no phone lines, just a wood stove, an old propane lantern, and the well behind the cabin. When I pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little on one side, the porch boards gray and splintered. My uncle hadn't been exaggerating when he said it needed work. I hauled my gear inside, dropped everything on the old table, and stood there in the silence. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears, the kind you don't get in town. I spent the first few hours airing the place out. The smell of old wood and dust had settled thick inside. I swept dead bugs off the floor, brushed cobwebs from the corners, and dragged my mattress onto the old iron bed frame in the single bedroom. By the time the sun sank low, I was sweaty and tired but felt like I'd made the place livable. The first night was strange. I lay in bed with the windows cracked open, listening to the woods. Every sound carried sharp, the chirp of crickets, the sudden bark of something far off, branches popping under their own weight. I kept telling myself it was just nature, nothing unusual, but being alone makes small noises grow teeth. I barely slept. The days that followed were easier. I settled into a rhythm, splitting wood, walking the trails behind the cabin, boiling water from the well. I cooked beans and rice on the little propane stove and sometimes fried up fish when I caught any from the creek a mile down. On the 5th day, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. I was out back stacking firewood when I found boot prints near the edge of the treeline. They weren't mine. The soles were wider, the tread different. The prints weren't old either. The soil was still damp from the night before and the edges were clean. Someone had walked close to the cabin. At first, I told myself it could have been left from before I came, maybe even my uncle or a hunter passing through. But the direction of the prints bothered me. They weren't heading away. They led toward the cabin, circled partway, and then turned back into the woods. I brushed it off, tried not to overthink, but that night the silence felt different. The following morning, I woke up to find something strange on the porch. A half-burnt cigarette but sat near the steps. I didn't smoke. I hadn't seen anyone on the road, hadn't heard an engine or voices. Whoever left it had been close enough to stand right outside while I was inside sleeping. That day I kept busy, but I couldn't shake the unease. I checked the shed beside the cabin where the tools were kept. The lock on the hasp looked scratched, as if someone had tried to force it. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell, but I felt exposed, like someone had been testing my awareness. I decided to be more careful at night. I barred the front door with a heavy piece of wood and kept my axe close to the bed. Sleep didn't come easy. I woke often, listening, holding my breath when I thought I heard footsteps outside. On the 8th night, just after midnight, I was certain. I had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the crunch of gravel near the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, not an animal. The boards of the porch creaked under weight. I lay frozen, every nerve screaming. Then silence. Whoever it was stood out there for minutes that felt like hours. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the steps retreated back into the woods. In the morning, I checked. The dew was heavy on the grass, but there were clear depressions where someone had stood. My chest tightened when I saw them. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was watching the cabin. I considered leaving right then, but part of me wanted to hold my ground. I told myself maybe it was some drifter, someone curious, maybe harmless. I tried to rationalize, but deep down, I knew this wasn't random. The next day, I carried my supplies into the cabin and packed them near the door, ready in case I had to bolt. I checked my truck twice, made sure the keys were always in my pocket. The hours dragged by. That night, I set a chair by the window and sat in the dark with the lantern out. I kept watch. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement at the tree line, a figure tall and still, half hidden behind the trees. I squinted, my heart pounding, and then I saw the faint glow of a cigarette flare in the dark. Someone was just standing there, smoking, watching. I stayed motionless until the glow faded and the figure melted back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay. I loaded the truck as quick as I could. Every sound in the forest made me whip my head. The whole time I felt eyes on me. As I slammed the last box into the bed of the truck, I noticed something on the porch rail, a piece of folded paper tucked under a rock. I hesitated but grabbed it. The note was short, written in messy block letters with a pencil. "You shouldn't be here." That was enough. I didn't even bother checking if I left anything behind. I drove out, tires spitting dirt, not slowing until I hit the paved road miles away. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, I heard from my uncle. He said he had gone up to check on the place, only to find the front door pried open and the shed emptied of tools. Whoever had been watching me hadn't just passed through. They had moved in once I was gone. It's been years since then, but I still think about those nights. The sound of someone on the porch, the cigarette glow in the trees, the note left where I'd see it. People sometimes imagine the woods are empty, harmless, just trees and animals. But the truth is, the scariest thing out there wasn't the silence or the dark. It was another person, standing close enough to touch the walls, waiting for me to let my guard down. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and drive out to the old hunting cabin my uncle once owned. The place sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, about 40 miles from the nearest small town. I had been working long hours at my job and felt like I needed space to breathe. A few days without ringing phones, emails, and traffic. My dog, a black lab named Bruno, was the only company I wanted. He was 5 years old at the time, full of energy, and always happiest when he was somewhere wide open with trees and streams to explore. The drive out took most of the day. By the time I pulled off the 2-lane road onto the narrow dirt track that wound toward the cabin, the sun was already sinking lower. The dirt road was rough, covered with patches of mud from recent rains, and lined with tall trees that leaned in close, their leaves already falling in heaps across the ground. I hadn't been to the cabin in years, and I half expected it to be falling apart. But when I finally pulled up, it looked almost the same as I remembered. The roof sagged slightly, but it was intact, and the wooden porch was still solid enough. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, but it was clean enough once I opened the windows. I set down my bags, fed Bruno, and got the small wood stove going. The sound of the crackling fire filled the space quickly, and it was comforting after the long day. Bruno lay on the rug by the stove, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. That first night, I slept deeply. The woods around the cabin were silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. When I woke in the morning, the light was gray and thin, and there was a heavy mist clinging to the ground outside. I drank coffee on the porch with Bruno sitting at my feet, watching the fog drift slowly through the trees. It felt peaceful, almost like the world outside didn't exist. The second night was when things began to change. I had spent most of the day hiking around the woods with Bruno, following deer trails and exploring old logging paths that twisted away into the trees. By the time we got back, I was tired and sore, and the sun was already sliding down behind the treetops. I cooked a simple meal, fed Bruno again, and settled into a chair by the stove with a book. Outside, darkness settled thick and heavy. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. The fire in the stove had died down to faint glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with shadows. Then I realized Bruno was standing at the door, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. His low growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound I had rarely heard from him. I sat still, straining my ears. At first, there was nothing but the faint creak of the wooden walls. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside, moving across the fallen leaves. They weren't the quick movements of an animal. They were heavy, steady, like someone walking carefully near the cabin. My chest tightened, and I felt a pulse of adrenaline. Out here, so far from anyone else, it didn't make sense for there to be someone walking around. I didn't have a gun, only a heavy flashlight and a long hunting knife I had brought for chores. I reached for the flashlight, keeping it off for the moment, and waited. The steps stopped for a while, then picked up again, circling. Bruno's growl grew sharper, his teeth bared now as he stared at the door. I felt the air grow colder as the seconds stretched. I didn't move, barely breathed, listening to whoever or whatever was just beyond the thin wooden walls. Eventually, the sound faded. I waited a long time before I finally dozed off again, the knife still in my hand. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. The leaves were scattered with fresh tracks, human tracks, large boots pressed into the damp soil near the porch. I counted at least 6 or 7 prints before they vanished into the underbrush. My stomach turned as I realized someone had been right outside while I was inside sleeping. That day, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept Bruno close as I gathered wood and checked the cabin's small shed. Every sound of cracking branches or bird calls made me glance over my shoulder. I told myself it was probably just a hunter passing through, but the deliberate way the steps had circled the cabin didn't fit. By the third night, my nerves were frayed. I had barricaded the door with a chair and stacked wood against the windows. Bruno never left my side, his ears constantly twitching at small noises outside. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up, every sound magnified in the silence. Then, close to 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The steps, slow, steady, crunching across the leaves. My breath caught in my throat. This time, they stopped right by the porch. Bruno stiffened and let out a sharp bark. His body pressed to the door. I switched on the flashlight and pointed it at the small gap in the window. For a moment, I caught a glimpse. A tall figure standing at the edge of the porch, motionless. The beam of light reflected off something metallic near their hand before they turned sharply and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat there with the flashlight and knife, Bruno pressed against me, both of us staring at the door until the first gray light of morning finally came. That was enough. I packed my bags as soon as the sun rose higher. I wasn't going to spend another night in that cabin. The thought of someone walking circles around me while I slept made my skin crawl, and the image of that figure on the porch burned itself into my mind. As I loaded the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement among the trees. Bruno stayed close, his tail low, his body tense like he felt the same unease I did. The drive out along the dirt road felt longer than it had on the way in, every bump and shadow making me grip the wheel tighter. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension slowly began to ease, but the memory of those footsteps stayed with me. Out there, in the woods where no one else should have been, someone had come to my cabin. They hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken, hadn't left a note. They had just stood there, watching, circling, waiting. Even now, years later, I remember that night every time I hear a branch snap in the dark. The cabin still stands, but I never went back after that trip. Some places, once you've felt that kind of fear, lose all their peace. Bruno is older now, slower, but when he hears something outside at night, his ears still prick in the same sharp way, and I feel that same tightness in my chest. I don't think it ever fully goes away. I was 29 years old in the fall of 1997 when I agreed to spend a few nights in a rundown cabin near the edge of a small graveyard in northern Maine. The cabin had once belonged to a caretaker, or so the locals told me, though it hadn't been used for years. The place was isolated, sitting about half a mile down a dirt track off a two-lane road that itself rarely saw traffic. I had been working seasonal jobs back then, drifting from place to place, and I thought the solitude might give me time to clear my head. The cabin was nothing more than a single-story box with a small porch, its roof sagging at one corner, shingles loose and weather-beaten. The wood siding was gray, almost silver, from years of harsh weather. The front steps wobbled when I put my weight on them. Inside, it was bare and cold with two small rooms, a front space with a cracked wood stove, and an empty back room that had a rotting bed frame pushed against the wall. The floor creaked with every step, and the smell was a mix of old wood, mildew, and damp earth. Just past the back of the cabin, maybe 30 yards through the trees, was the graveyard. It wasn't a big one, maybe 20 or 30 headstones scattered across a clearing. The stones were old, many leaning, their writing faded. Some were broken in half or had sunken into the ground. The grass around them was overgrown, thick with weeds, and in the evenings the place looked especially bleak. A rusted chain-link fence ran halfway around it but stopped short, as if whoever built it gave up midway. I didn't like looking at it, but it was impossible to ignore since it was so close. The first night I stayed there, the air dropped cold after sunset, and the quiet pressed in from all sides. No cars, no voices, no lights beyond the lantern I had carried with me. The nearest neighbor was a few miles away, and even though I told myself that was fine, I couldn't shake the strange awareness that I was truly on my own. Every snap of a branch outside sounded sharper. Every gust of wind through the broken window frame seemed louder. I slept badly, my mind stuck on the sight of those crooked gravestones just beyond the trees. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves. It was faint but steady, moving slowly across the clearing. I held my breath and listened, heart hammering. The steps stopped, then started again, circling near the cabin, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavy, too measured to be anything small. After a long while they faded away, and I lay awake until the first thin light of morning. The next day I walked around the graveyard to convince myself I was being foolish. The grass was wet with dew, and my shoes soaked through quickly. The stones looked older in the daylight, some with dates going back to the late 1800s. I noticed fresh impressions in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, as if someone had stood there recently. The ground was soft, and the marks looked like boot prints, though they weren't very clear. My first thought was that local kids had been sneaking out there, maybe using the old graveyard to drink or smoke. I tried to brush it off, but the idea of strangers hanging around made me uneasy. That second night, I built a small fire in the stove to keep the cold away. The wood hissed and popped, and the light from the flames threw shadows across the cabin walls. I tried to read an old paperback I had brought, but I couldn't focus. Every so often, I caught myself glancing toward the back window that looked out in the direction of the graveyard. The glass was dirty and cracked, but I swore I saw movement a few times, just quick enough to unsettle me. When I finally put the book down and tried to sleep, I lay staring at the ceiling, ears straining for any sound. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of steps in the leaves. They were closer this time, moving slowly around the cabin itself. I sat up, listening hard. The fire in the stove had died down, and the room was almost pitch black. The steps circled once, then paused near the back wall. I could hear the faint rasp of breathing, as if someone was standing just outside, no more than a few feet away. My throat went dry, and I sat frozen, waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound drifted off into the trees. I didn't move until morning light filtered in through the cracks. That day, I considered leaving. I had only planned to stay 3 or 4 nights anyway, and the unease was wearing on me. But pride and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was just spooking myself with stories, imagining things because of how close the graves were. I spent the afternoon stacking what dry wood I could find and checking the cabin over. That was when I noticed faint scratches near the back door frame. Thin, shallow lines, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the wood not long ago. The sight of them sent a chill through me. The third night was the worst. I went to bed early, exhausted from lack of sleep, but sometime in the dark I woke to a faint rattling sound. It took me a second to realize it was the back door handle turning. Slow, cautious, as if whoever was out there was testing it. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest would burst. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps moving toward the front porch. The wood groaned under the weight of someone stepping on it. I sat up and reached for the old fire poker by the stove, gripping it tight in my hand. My mouth was dry, palms sweating. The front door didn't have much of a lock, just a loose latch, and I stared at it, waiting for it to move. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as suddenly, the steps retreated, fading away into the woods. At dawn, I walked outside, nerves still rattled. The ground was damp, and sure enough, fresh boot prints circled the cabin. They were clear this time, deep impressions of a man's work boots. I followed them a little way, back toward the graveyard. They led to one of the far corners, stopping near a headstone that had toppled over. The dirt there looked disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up and packed back down. My stomach knotted as I stared at it, realizing someone had been out there digging at night, just a short walk from where I was sleeping. That was enough for me. I packed my things quickly, heart racing, and didn't look back as I walked down the dirt track toward the main road. I didn't stop until I reached town, where I found a small diner and sat shaking over a cup of coffee. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there, circling the graveyard and testing the doors. Maybe it was someone using the graveyard for something illegal, hiding things, or digging where no one was supposed to dig. Maybe it was just someone unwell, roaming the woods at night. All I know is that I wasn't supposed to be there, and whoever it was made sure I felt it. Even now, years later, I remember those slow footsteps around the cabin and the sound of the door handle turning in the dark. And I'm glad I left when I did, because staying any longer might not have ended the same way. It was the fall of 1998 when I took a seasonal job as a park ranger in northern Montana. I was 28 years old, still figuring out what I wanted from life, and the thought of spending a few months surrounded by silence, trees, and cold mountain air seemed like the right thing to do. The park wasn't as busy that time of year, so most of my work came down to patrols, maintenance, and making sure hunters stayed within legal boundaries. They gave me a small cabin near the edge of the park, tucked away about a half-mile from the ranger station. It wasn't much more than 4 walls of weathered wood, a tin roof, and a fireplace that smoked more than it warmed, but I was glad for it. The days passed quietly in the beginning. I would walk the trails, check posted signs, and log any damage to the paths or campgrounds. The cabin had no phone line, and the radio worked only on good days when the weather stayed calm. At night, the woods seemed to fold in closer. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and I would hear branches snapping outside as deer or elk moved through. The noises never bothered me at first. It was just the sound of nature doing what it always did. By late October, the weather shifted. Rain turned into icy drizzle, and nights dipped below freezing. I kept the cabin stacked with firewood, but I noticed how quickly it burned through the pile. Every night I felt the temperature settle into the floorboards, and sometimes I would wake up to see my breath curling in the air above my bed. That was when I started hearing things that didn't sit right. The first time, it was close to midnight. I had gone to bed early, but the crack of something heavy against the side of the cabin jolted me awake. At first, I thought it might have been a branch blown down by the wind, but when I stepped outside with a flashlight, there was nothing. No fallen branch, no tracks in the mud, just silence and my own breath clouding the air. Over the next few nights, more things happened. I would hear slow, heavy steps outside on the porch, but when I opened the door, the steps would stop. I found the screen door hanging open twice, though I swore I latched it shut. The oddest thing was the smell. A sharp, metallic odor would drift through the cabin sometimes, something like rust mixed with wet earth. It would come suddenly and then vanish without a trace. I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves adjusting to being alone in the woods. Still, I began paying more attention during my patrols. I noticed places where the brush seemed pushed down as if something large had been moving through. I saw trees with their bark stripped in long, rough scratches. Once, about 2 miles from the cabin, I came across a deer carcass that had been torn apart. It wasn't clean like a wolf or cougar kill. It was scattered, pieces of it dragged around in a wide circle, as though whatever had done it had no interest in eating, just destroying. At night, sleep came harder. I would lie in bed listening to the fire crackle down to embers, every little noise outside setting me on edge. The crunch of leaves, the pop of wood, the faint rustle of something brushing against the cabin wall. My flashlight stayed on the table within reach, my rifle leaning against the chair. One evening in early November, a storm rolled in. The rain hammered the tin roof, and wind shook the shutters so hard I thought they might rip free. The radio was dead. I sat by the fire with a lantern burning, trying to read, but the words kept blurring. That smell came back, stronger than before, so strong I gagged. I grabbed the lantern and stepped outside. The rain came down in sheets, soaking me instantly. I swung the light toward the tree line and caught sight of something pale between the trees. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, just that it moved fast when the light hit it. The rest of that night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle across my lap and listened to the rain die down into a quiet I didn't trust. At dawn, I searched the area. Mud around the cabin showed deep impressions. Not boots, not hooves. They looked almost like prints but stretched and uneven, like someone had walked barefoot through the muck, dragging their toes. The strange part was how wide apart they were, as though whatever made them had a long stride. Days blurred after that. I grew restless, checking over my shoulder on patrol, glancing out the windows every few minutes when I was inside. Food didn't taste right anymore. I ate only because I had to. Sleep came in fits, and each time I woke, I swore I heard something outside. The breaking point came one night near the middle of the month. I had just finished stacking wood by the stove when the cabin went completely still. No wind, no rain, no creak of trees in the distance, just silence so thick it pressed in against my ears. Then came a sound scratching, slow and steady, along the back wall of the cabin. I froze. The fire popped, but the scratching kept on, dragging against the boards like nails over wood. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, though it was probably less than a minute. Then, as sudden as it started, the noise stopped. I sat in the chair all night, rifle in my hands, staring at the walls, waiting for something to break through. But nothing came. At sunrise, I forced myself outside to look. Along the back wall of the cabin, deep grooves cut into the wood. They weren't neat claw marks like an animal. They looked deliberate, straight lines dragged downward over and over again. I packed my bag that morning. I hiked to the main ranger station, not looking back once. When I got there, I turned in my keys and told them the cabin needed repairs from storm damage. I didn't mention the tracks or the carcass or the scratches in the wood. I figured no one would believe me, or worse, they'd think I'd lost my grip out there alone. I never went back to that cabin. I heard later that another ranger stayed there the next season. He left after 3 weeks without giving much of a reason. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, but I don't ever plan to see it again. What stuck with me most wasn't the noises or the strange prints. It was that feeling in the air when everything went quiet, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know nature never really goes silent. Something was out there near that cabin, something real, something I couldn't explain, and I've never looked at the wilderness the same way since. I was 29 when I agreed to look after my uncle's farm in southern Illinois for a week. It was late September of 1998, and he and my aunt were driving down to Florida for a wedding. They needed someone to feed the animals, lock the barn at night, and keep an eye on the place. I had grown up visiting that farm as a kid, but I had never stayed out there alone before. The property sat far back from the county road, surrounded by miles of empty fields and old tree lines that seemed to stretch forever. There were no neighbors within sight, just corn stubble, dirt paths, and the endless horizon. The cabin I stayed in wasn't some hunting shack. It was the old farmhouse my uncle had lived in for years before moving into the newer house closer to town. It was small, with faded wooden siding, a sagging front porch, and creaky floors that never seemed level. The plumbing barely worked, and the electricity flickered sometimes if you ran more than one thing at once. Still, it was warm and it had a bed, a stove, and a fridge, so I told myself I'd be fine. The first couple of days passed without much trouble. I spent my mornings feeding the cows and chickens, checking the barn doors, and making sure the old tractor wasn't leaking oil all over the place. During the afternoons, I usually sat out on the porch, drinking coffee and listening to the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful in its own lonely way. At night, though, the quiet started to feel heavier, the kind of silence where every little sound, Creaking wood, a distant animal cry, stood out like a gunshot. The first night I really noticed something was off was the third night. I was sitting in the cabin, reading with a weak lamp buzzing on the side table, when I heard gravel crunching outside, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought maybe it was one of the barn cats, but the sound was too heavy. I got up and peered through the small window, but the darkness was thick and my reflection blocked most of the view. I stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in hand, but when I scanned the yard, nothing was there. Just the wind rustling through the old cornstalks stacked near the fence. I brushed it off and told myself it was probably a raccoon. Still, I locked the door that night, something I hadn't bothered with the first 2 nights. The next morning, I found boot prints in the soft dirt by the barn. They weren't mine, and they weren't my uncle's either. He wore wide work boots, and these were narrow, almost pointed at the toes. They led up one side of the barn and stopped by the wall, then turned back toward the woods. It didn't make much sense. I stood there for a long while, staring at them, then shook it off and went about feeding the animals. That night, the noises got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound near the back of the cabin. It was faint at first, but then it grew sharper, like something dragging along the siding. I lay there frozen, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. It moved slowly from one side of the wall to the other. I finally worked up the nerve to grab the flashlight again. I opened the back door and swept the beam across the yard. Nothing, just the old fence posts and the long grass swaying. But when I looked down near the base of the wall, I saw faint marks, fresh scratches in the wood that hadn't been there before. By the 5th day, I was running on edge. Every little noise made me jump. I checked the locks on the cabin door 3 times each night before lying down. That afternoon, while carrying feed to the chicken coop, I noticed something else strange. One of the chickens was missing. No feathers, no blood, nothing, just gone. I checked the fencing, and though it was old, it was intact. Coyotes sometimes came through, but they usually left a mess. This was clean, too clean. That evening, as the sun was dropping behind the trees, I caught sight of movement near the far end of the field. At first I thought it was a deer, but then I realized it was upright. Someone was standing there, half hidden at the tree line, watching. I froze in place, my throat tightening. I couldn't make out a face, just a figure standing unnaturally still. I blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the back door knob jiggle softly. The sound was so slight I almost thought I imagined it. But then it rattled again, harder this time. My chest pounded. I grabbed the rifle my uncle kept in the cabin corner and sat there in the dark, waiting, listening. After a while, it went quiet. When I finally forced myself to look outside, the knob was smeared with dirt, as if someone had tried twisting it with muddy hands. The final night was the worst. The air was heavy and damp, the kind of night where the crickets sounded muffled and distant. I had locked up the barn earlier than usual and double-checked the cabin. I sat awake in bed, not even trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Footsteps outside, circling slow, crunching over the gravel and dirt. They paused near the porch. The boards creaked, as if someone had stepped onto them. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. Then came the sound of something being dragged, long and rough, across the porch planks. I pictured a shovel or maybe a sack. The dragging lasted for what felt like forever, then stopped. I sat there gripping the rifle, sweating, my throat dry as dust. Minutes crawled by. Then, a sudden sharp knock rattled the door. Not a polite knock, 3 heavy bangs, deliberate and slow. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, praying they would go away. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The footsteps faded back toward the woods. I sat there until dawn, unable to close my eyes. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door, rifle still in hand. The porch boards were scraped deep, long grooves cutting into the wood. A dead chicken lay by the steps, its neck twisted unnaturally, but no blood. Next to it was a single, narrow boot print pressed into the dirt, facing the cabin. I followed the prints with my eyes, but they disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by the shadows. I didn't wait around to see more. I packed my things, locked the cabin, and drove into town. I called my uncle from a payphone and told him I couldn't stay out there any longer. I didn't give him details, just that something wasn't right. He didn't press me, maybe because he heard the strain in my voice. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. All I know is that someone had been circling that cabin at night, watching, testing the doors, and leaving signs to remind me they were there. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't my imagination. It was someone real, someone who knew how to stay just out of reach. And that was enough to make me never step foot on that farm alone again. I was 35 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was the summer of 2014, and I had been working long shifts at a factory, barely sleeping, living off gas station coffee, and I felt worn down. My plan was to get out of town, disconnect from everything, and just rest. A coworker had a small family cabin about 2 miles off a dirt road near the Canadian border. He told me it was quiet, old, but decent enough for a short stay. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, and nothing around but forest, swamps, and lakes. At the time, that sounded perfect. The cabin sat back off a narrow trail, almost swallowed by trees. The structure itself looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It was a single-story place with weathered wooden siding that had faded to a dull gray, a tin roof streaked with rust, and a screened-in porch that sagged a little on one side. A padlock hung on the door, but the key my coworker gave me slid it open easily. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and dust. The furniture was plain. 2 old chairs, a short couch with stuffing pushing out from the seams, a wood stove that hadn't been lit in who knows how long, and a single small bedroom with a thin mattress. The first day passed quietly. I set my bag down, aired out the rooms, swept the floor with the old broom leaning against the wall, and stacked firewood on the porch. By evening, I was sitting out there with a cheap folding knife in one pocket and a warm beer in hand, listening to the endless noise of crickets and frogs. The silence between their calls was heavy, but it didn't bother me yet. The second night was when things began to feel wrong. I had woken up sometime after midnight to use the bathroom. The cabin had no plumbing, just an outhouse about 30 yards into the trees. When I stepped outside, I noticed how unusually still it was. No bugs, no whine through the leaves, just a thick quiet that made the hair on my neck stand up. I tried not to think too much of it. On my way back from the outhouse, I saw something strange by the edge of the clearing. It was faint in the moonlight, but clear enough to make me pause. A large patch of ground looked disturbed, as if someone had been digging there not long ago. The soil was dark and loose, turned up in a wide oval. I crouched closer and ran my fingers through it. It wasn't like a small animal hole or anything. This looked bigger, like someone with a shovel had been working there. I went back inside quickly, locked the door, and tried to sleep. My mind raced, telling me it was nothing, maybe an old fire pit or a half-dug hole that had filled back in. Still, I kept waking up, glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone staring in. The next morning, I walked over to check the dirt again in daylight. It looked worse in the sun. The hole was shallow, maybe 3 feet wide, and scattered with torn roots and clumps of damp soil. Tracks pressed into the ground around it. At first I thought they were from a deer, but these weren't shaped right. They looked more like boots, heavy-soled and deep enough that whoever made them had been there recently, maybe within a day or two. I didn't like the feeling it gave me. It was broad daylight, but I felt watched. I decided to take a walk down to the lake, partly to clear my head, partly to check if maybe someone had been camping out there. The trail was overgrown, but I made it through, about half a mile to the water's edge. No tents, no boats, no sign of anyone. Just silence. When I came back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The porch chair, the one I had left pushed up against the cabin wall, was now sitting directly in front of the door. I had no memory of moving it, and I was certain I hadn't. The cushion was bent, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. That night was worse. I lit the lantern early, locked the door, and kept my knife on the table beside me. Around midnight, I heard crunching in the leaves outside. Slow steps, circling the cabin, pausing every few feet. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped near the window beside the couch. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, just stared at the shadowy square of glass, waiting for something to appear. Minutes passed. My chest felt tight. Then the footsteps started again, retreating this time, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I found prints in the dirt outside, clear boot marks the same as around the hole. They circled the entire cabin. Someone had been out there, watching, moving slowly around me while I sat inside. I told myself I should leave, but something in me didn't want to admit I was scared. I tried to convince myself it could have been a hunter, someone passing through, maybe kids messing around. But deep down, I knew it was none of those things. The fourth day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for more signs. That's when I found the second hole. This one was closer, right behind the cabin, half hidden by bushes. Same size, same fresh soil, same boot prints around it. 2 shallow graves, only yards from where I slept. That was it for me. I packed my bag fast, threw it in the truck, and started down the dirt road. But the road wasn't empty. A white pickup sat about a quarter-mile down, parked halfway into the ditch. It was old, rusty, with no plates. I slowed down, heart hammering, and saw the windshield cracked, a shovel resting in the bed. I didn't stop. I drove past without looking, gripping the wheel so hard my hands ached. The whole way back to town, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting that truck to come roaring up behind me. It never did. When I returned the cabin key to my coworker the next week, I didn't tell him much. I just said I didn't sleep well and left it at that. I don't know if he ever went back there, and I never asked. But I can't stop thinking about those holes, dug neat and shallow, waiting for something. And the chair, pulled in front of the door, like someone had been sitting close, watching me. I left before they finished whatever they had started. But sometimes I think about how long they had been there before I noticed, and whether the next person who stays there will be smart enough to leave before it's too late. I still remember the year 2012 when I took a trip out to a small cabin in Northumberland, not far from the Scottish border. I was 30 years old then, and I had been spending too much time stuck in London, drained by the noise, the people, and the constant rush of the city. I had been looking forward to a break from all of that, so I rented a small place through an old listing I had found online. It was described as quiet, rural, and isolated, and that was exactly what I wanted. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. It sat at the edge of a stretch of woods that looked like they went on forever. It was built from dark timber, single floor, with 2 small rooms, a wood-burning stove, and a small kitchen. The roof looked patched in places, and the door creaked each time I opened it. It wasn't modern in any way, no proper heating, no TV, no internet. Just the sound of the wind across the moors and the occasional call of birds from the trees. That isolation was the point, though. The first few days went by quietly. I spent time walking the trails, taking photos of the hills, and reading old books I'd brought along. In the evenings, I would light the stove, cook simple meals on the small gas hob, and listen to the rain tapping on the roof. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt my chest loosen, like I could breathe properly again. It was on the fourth night when something began to unsettle me. I had just finished washing the dishes in the small sink when I looked out the window above it. The night was black, no moon, no streetlights anywhere near. My reflection was the only thing I could make out in the glass, and yet I felt that if I looked long enough, something else would be there too. I told myself it was just the silence getting to me. I went to bed not long after. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The air inside the cabin was colder, and there was a strange smell I couldn't place, like damp clothes that had been shut in a bag too long. When I opened the front door, the smell wasn't there, only fresh wet grass and pine. I assumed it had been the stove smoking a little in the night. I thought no more of it and went out for a long walk along the dirt track that wound through the woods. By the time I returned, the day was already fading. Clouds had gathered thick and low, and I could feel a storm was coming. I chopped wood outside until my arms ached, then carried the logs inside to stack by the stove. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the tree line, about 40 yards from the cabin, the ground looked disturbed, as though someone had walked there recently. It wasn't the normal unevenness of mud after rain. These looked like footprints, faint but in a direct line toward the cabin and then back toward the woods. I crouched, studied them, and felt my stomach tighten. They weren't boot prints like mine. They were smaller, narrower, maybe a woman's shoes. At first, I thought it could have been an old print left by a hiker, but the ground was too soft for them to be old. They had to be from that same day. I told myself it didn't matter. People walked through these woods, even if rarely. The cabin wasn't on private land. But that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about the direction of those footprints. They hadn't just gone past. They had stopped near the cabin before turning back. It was past midnight when I woke to a faint noise outside. It was hard to place at first, muffled by the walls and the storm that had started to pour. I stayed still in bed, holding my breath, listening. There it was again, something brushing against the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like cloth dragging across wood. Then silence. Then, after a few minutes, the crunch of movement in the wet dirt. I got out of bed quietly and stepped into the main room. My heart was thudding so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't switch on the light. Instead, I stood by the window, looking through the narrow gap in the curtains. At first, I saw nothing but the rain hammering down, turning everything into a blur. But then my eyes adjusted, and I froze. There was a figure. A woman, I thought, though it was hard to be sure at first. She stood by the tree line, not moving, facing the cabin. Her clothes were dark, clinging to her from the rain, and her hair looked plastered against her head. Even through the distance, I could see her pale face, though her features were hard to make out in the dark. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The storm grew worse, wind howling, trees swaying. But she never moved, never even shifted her stance. At last, I backed away from the window, locked the door, and sat by the stove with my head in my hands. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, she was gone. When I finally opened the door, the trees were empty. The ground where she had stood was marked again by footprints, clear and fresh. They led from the trees to the spot and back, the same as before. I felt sick looking at them. I considered leaving that morning, but part of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was a lost hiker, maybe she had some strange reason for being there. The mind grabs for excuses when it doesn't want to face the truth. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was alone, and no one was interested in me. I tried to carry on, but 2 nights later, she came closer. I heard the footsteps first, softer this time, circling the cabin. I didn't dare look out the window. I sat in bed, gripping the torch in my hand, every muscle in my body tight. The steps circled slowly, pausing now and then, like she was testing the walls, the door. At one point, I heard the faint rattle of the handle, then nothing. When morning came, I went outside and saw the ground all around the cabin had been marked. Dozens of footprints, some right up against the door, some beneath the windows. She had been there most of the night. That was enough. I packed my bag within an hour. The rain hadn't let up, but I didn't care. I carried everything out to the small car I'd rented and drove away, not looking back at the cabin once. The road was muddy, the tires slipping as I pushed the car faster than I should have. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they hurt. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a petrol station and sat there for half an hour, breathing heavily, watching the rain streak across the glass. I couldn't shake the image of her face, pale and blurred in the storm, watching from the trees. I never went back to that cabin. I told the rental owner by email that I had to leave early, inventing some excuse about work. I didn't mention the woman. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. She wasn't a ghost or some storybook figure. She was real, a woman, alive, who had chosen to come to that cabin night after night, standing in the dark, circling, testing the door. I don't know what she wanted, and I don't want to, but I know for certain that if I had stayed one more night, she would have tried harder to come inside. That's the part that keeps me awake even now, knowing how close it was, and how easily I could have been another story no one ever got to hear. I remember it was the autumn of 1996 when I decided to drive out to the northern part of Minnesota, far from where most people lived. I had been working long hours in a metal shop, and I wanted time away from the noise and the endless rhythm of the city. I wanted quiet. I had found a cheap hunting permit and decided to spend a few days out near a lake where the woods grew thick and the dirt roads stretched for miles. I borrowed my father's old pickup and packed food, water, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and a small .22 rifle I had been meaning to test out. By late afternoon, I turned off the gravel road and followed a trail that looked like it hadn't been driven on in years. My tires cracked over branches and scraped against stones hidden beneath leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it felt, as if the trees closed themselves around me. The air was colder too, sharp with the smell of wet pine and rotting bark. I planned to find a spot near the water to set up camp, but the trail twisted in a way I didn't expect, and after another 20 minutes of bumping along, I saw something at the edge of a clearing. It was a cabin, old, gray, with stood warped and crooked, the roof sagging under years of weather. One window was missing, replaced by a sheet of plywood nailed unevenly across it. The door looked swollen, as if it had been soaked in rain too many times. My first thought was that it was abandoned maybe decades ago, but the clearing around it was strange. Grass grew high, but there were faint tracks in the dirt, as though something heavy had been dragged across at some point in recent months. I parked the truck a little back from the clearing and walked closer. The cabin was small, no more than 2 rooms. A rusted stovepipe stuck out from the roof. The walls carried claw marks of weather, splintered wood, cracks, patches where shingles had fallen off. I pushed on the door, and it creaked open, stiff against the frame. Inside, the air smelled like mold and dust, heavy enough to sting my nose. A table leaned to one side with one leg broken. The remains of a chair lay scattered in pieces on the floor. In one corner sat a narrow bed frame with no mattress, just springs covered in rust. The boards creaked under my boots, and in the far wall I noticed holes chewed by mice. What struck me most, though, was that someone had been there more recently than the cabin's age suggested. In the middle of the table sat a tin can with a torn-off label. Inside were cigarette butts not more than a year old. The wood near the stove had been scraped clean, as if someone had dragged it to burn. I froze when I noticed faint boot prints in the dust on the floorboards. They weren't mine. For a long time, I stood in the doorway listening. The woods outside were quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into your ears. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of squirrels. I told myself whoever had been here was long gone, but the unease stayed with me. I stepped back outside, thinking I'd sleep in my truck instead, but curiosity kept me circling the cabin. Behind it, near the edge of the tree line, I found something worse. A pit about 3 feet deep, dug into the soil. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't filled in yet either. The edges were still sharp, and leaves hadn't fully covered the bottom. There were scraps of cloth buried in it, dark, stiff with what I guessed was dried blood. I crouched there, staring, and my stomach turned cold. The thought hit me hard. This wasn't just an old hunting shack. Someone had been using this place, and not in a good way. My hands felt sweaty even in the cool air. I stood up, scanning the woods, half expecting someone to be watching me. Nothing moved, but the silence had a weight to it, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I walked back to my truck and sat behind the wheel, trying to steady my nerves. The sun had dipped lower, orange light bleeding through the trees. I debated leaving right then, but the trail back was rough, and driving it in the dark would be worse. I decided I'd stay one night in the truck, lock the doors, and leave at first light. I tried to convince myself it was safer to stick with the plan than to risk crashing on the way out. As night came, the woods turned black faster than I thought. I cracked the window for air and pulled the sleeping bag over myself. Every sound outside felt louder, branches snapping, leaves shifting. Around midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Slow footsteps on the leaves, not far from where I parked. They came from the direction of the cabin, steady, unhurried. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped near the side of the truck, maybe 10 feet away. I didn't move. My rifle lay behind the seat, but reaching for it would make noise. The air inside the truck felt tight. After what felt like minutes, the footsteps moved again, this time circling toward the back. Gravel shifted under weight, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My eyes stayed locked on the windshield, waiting for something to appear out of the dark. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. The hours dragged, and when the first pale light crept through the trees, I wasted no time. I started the truck and drove out without even checking behind me. On the way back down the trail, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin shrank out of sight, swallowed by the woods, but the image burned into my mind. The pit behind it, the cigarette butts, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to me. By the time I reached the main gravel road, my nerves were raw, but I felt some relief with every mile I put between myself and that place. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station nearly an hour away. I sat at the pump with my hands gripping the wheel, thinking about what I'd seen. I never told anyone about it. I figured no one would believe me or they'd think I was overreacting to an old shack in the woods. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. Whoever had been using that cabin wasn't living there for comfort. That pit wasn't an accident. I never went back to that part of Minnesota again. To this day, nearly 30 years later, I can still see the clearing in my mind. I can smell the rot of the cabin and hear those slow steps in the night. And the worst part is not knowing who was out there with me or what they were planning. What I do know is simple. I was lucky to leave when I did. If I had gone inside that cabin a little longer, or if I had tried to camp nearby, I might not have driven away at all. That place wasn't empty. It was being used, and I had gotten too close. I was 36 years old when I went hunting alone in the fall of 2004, up in northern Minnesota. I had been out there before with friends, but this time was different. Everyone else backed out last minute, and I didn't want to waste the week I had taken off from work. I told myself it would be fine. I had a small cabin, a rifle, plenty of supplies, and I had been in the woods enough to know how to handle myself. At least that's what I thought before things turned bad. The cabin was nothing more than a one-room wooden box with a steel roof. I had built part of it with a buddy a few years earlier. It had no electricity, no plumbing, and the insulation wasn't great. The place always smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke from the iron stove in the corner. A small bunk bed was nailed against one wall, a table and chair against another, and a set of hooks where we usually hung coats and rifles. There wasn't much else to it. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The dirt road to get there was already soft with mud and covered in wet leaves from the past few days of rain. My truck barely made it through the last half mile. I had to gun the engine just to get over some washed out ruts. When I finally parked, I carried my gear in through the quiet trees. The woods were wet and silent, with that heavy smell of wet earth and pine needles. The first night passed quietly. I ate a can of chili by lantern light, sharpened my hunting knife, and listened to the rain on the roof. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't unusual. Deer, raccoons, and even black bears would sniff around cabins. Still, I got up, unlatched the rifle from the hook, and stood there in the dark listening. The sound was heavy, slow, like something dragging or stepping carefully through the wet leaves. It circled the cabin once, then faded back into the trees. I never saw what it was, and eventually I lay back down, though my nerves stayed tight for hours. The next morning, the ground was a mess of fresh tracks. Some were deer, easy to recognize, but others were odd. They weren't boots, that much I could tell. Bare feet maybe, or something that had a strange, uneven step. At first, I thought maybe some drunk local had wandered through the night before, but there were no tire marks on the road except mine, and no hunting stands or camps nearby. I pushed the thought away and got on with the day. I spent Friday hunting deeper into the woods. The weather stayed gray and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones when you stop moving. I hiked for hours without seeing much. By afternoon, I found a good clearing and sat at the edge, waiting. Nothing came. On my way back, I felt that prickling on the back of my neck. It was the feeling you get when someone is behind you, watching. I turned several times, scanning the brush and trees, but I saw nothing. When I got back to the cabin, there were new tracks. This time they were clearer in the mud just a few yards from the door. Bare human feet. I stared at them for a long time, counting at least 6 different prints. Whoever it was had walked around my cabin while I was gone. My first thought was that it was some vagrant, maybe a squatter living rough in the woods. The idea of someone watching my cabin while I was out unsettled me more than anything else. I went inside, slid the latch on the door, and kept the rifle close all night. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old wood sounded like footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching on the wall outside, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails down the siding. My chest felt tight, and I held the rifle in my lap, sitting there in the dark, heart pounding, until the sound stopped. Saturday morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with the rifle slung across my shoulder. The scratching was real. The wood was gouged in a long, uneven line about chest high. I followed the tracks out a ways into the trees. They led north into thick brush and eventually disappeared in the mud near a stream. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being lured further away. I turned back, uneasy. The day dragged on, and I didn't bother hunting. I stayed near the cabin, chopping wood, listening. The silence of the woods was heavy. Even the birds seemed to stay away. Around dusk, I spotted movement between the trees about 50 yards off. The figure, tall, thin, standing completely still. It was too far to make out details, but I knew it was a person. I raised my rifle, shouted out, though the sound of my own voice cracked in the cold air. The figure turned slowly and stepped back into the trees. I didn't follow. Instead, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat with my back against it for most of the night. I barely slept an hour, jerking awake at every sound, every creak. By Sunday morning, my nerves were shot. I told myself I would pack up and leave that day. I could come back with friends, but I wasn't staying alone any longer. I stepped outside to load the truck, and that's when I noticed the tracks again. They were all around the cabin now, dozens of them circling, coming close to the windows, the door. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing by. They had been watching me. I hurried through packing. My hands shook as I stuffed gear into bags. When I carried the last load to the truck, I stopped cold. A single bare footprint was pressed into the wet hood of my truck. It was large, wider than normal, and the mud had smeared across the windshield. Whoever it was had climbed onto my vehicle while I slept. That was enough. I started the truck, the engine roaring loud in the quiet woods, and I didn't stop for anything. I bounced down the rutted road, branches scraping the sides, mud spraying. I glanced in the rearview mirror only once, and I swear I saw someone standing in the tree line, tall and still, watching as I drove away. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I reached town. I parked at a diner, sat there in the lot, and felt my whole body shaking. I checked the hood again. There it was, the print, smeared but clear enough to know it wasn't my imagination. I didn't go back to that cabin the rest of the season. A few weeks later, I drove up with a couple friends to grab the rest of my gear. The place looked the same, but the tracks were gone, washed away by snow. We never found out who or what had been out there. I still own the cabin, but I never go alone anymore. Every time I walk through those woods, I feel that same heavy silence, that same sense of eyes following me between the trees. I don't talk about it much, but I know what I saw, and I know someone was out there. Not an animal, not a ghost, just someone who wanted me to know they were watching. That thought is what unsettles me most even now, because if they wanted to hurt me, they could have done it easily. Instead, they wanted me to leave, and they wanted me to remember